My name's Simon Lapthorne. I'm a partner in the employment team at KTC, and the most pressing issue for our clients at the moment is undoubtedly how to manage issues arising from the coronavirus pandemic. I'm joined by my colleague Laura Chapman, who's going to provide some essential advice for employers. Laura, over the weekend, the government imposed sweeping restrictions regarding travel and self-isolation requirements. How will this impact employers?
So in short, it's going to have quite a big impact, we think. So as at the 16th of March 2020, the official position is that anyone arriving in New Zealand must now self-isolate for a period of 14 days. That means employees who have returned on or after Monday of this week will not be able to physically come into the workplace for that whole quarantine period.
And so does this mean employers have to pay employees during this self-isolation period?
The potentially millions of dollar question. Well, the answer, as lawyers often say, but unfortunately is true, is it will depend on the circumstances of the employee. So the most straightforward situation, if we think about the different categories of employees, is where the employee is actually symptomatic or is sick. So if an employee is sick, they're entitled to use any accrued sick pay or sick leave that they have. Likewise, if their dependents are sick, they can utilise that leave for dependent leave. It's worth noting that employees and employers can also agree that sick or dependent leave could be used in advance of an entitlement, so up to that 5 days. Once the entitlements are exhausted, though, employees will be on unpaid sick leave unless the employer and the employee agree otherwise.
What's the position if an employee is not sick, but they're required to self-isolate as they've recently arrived from a foreign country?
So where they're not displaying any symptoms but they are required to self-isolate, there are a number of options. As a starting point, the employer is required to provide work for and to pay an employee who is ready, willing and able. In this scenario where employees are required to self-isolate, they might be ready and willing but not necessarily able because their inability to actually physically attend the workplace. So the first question might be, can they work from home, and have you got the facilities to be put in place to work from home, and is that something that employees habitually do? That's become more common in a lot of industries, as we know, and might assist to manage the problem. So if they can work from home and they are well to do so, then no real issue, things can continue as they are. For positions where it's not possible for the employee to work remotely, the employer and the employee might look to agree that the employee take some accrued annual leave. Again, where that's not possible because of either the employee has no leave or for some other reason, then the employee might be required to take unpaid leave in those circumstances. Having said that, I would just caution that there are a number of different ways in which employers might be able to approach this issue, and we are in pretty uncharted territory at the moment as to how that might happen. What I would say is if you are doing or looking at alternative working arrangements or something out of the ordinary for your business, then it will be important to document what you are doing, so what measures you're taking, the terms of those measures and how long those will last, just to make sure that all parties are really clear as to those measures that you're taking.
If the parties agree alternative working arrangements and the employee incurs additional expenses, so for example kind of higher internet costs, who's responsible for paying those?
Yeah, good question. I think the answer to that again will be it depends. So it might depend on your expense policy, so your out-of-pocket policies. I think the starting point for us is going to be if there are no out-of-pocket expenses, i.e. the extra internet charges or anything is something that the employee would actually incur in the normal course, then I suspect the answer is going to be there's no expenses to actually repay. If there are extra expenses, then we might need to look at who has imposed the term of leave and in what circumstances. So, for example, if an employee is voluntarily left the country knowing that they will be put in self-isolation when they return, it might be that any expenses from working at home at that point will be for the employee because they're voluntarily in that situation. If they've otherwise been isolated and through no fault, it might be that an employer then decides to cover those costs. So I think it will very much be a case-by-case scenario with that starting point of your own expense policies.
Are there any other considerations that employers should bear in mind if they do reach alternative working arrangements?
Yeah, so there's always going to be other factors to consider, and one example of that is that it's not as simple to say employees must all work from home and assume that that's all going to go smoothly. Of course, both employers and employees, as we'll discuss, I'm sure, have obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and so the employer still has to or still has responsibility for ensuring that employees have a healthy and safe work environment, as do employees. So you will still need to make sure of that even when the employee is working from home. So it might be prudent to look at now assessing your policies as to how you look at those health and safety requirements and how you make sure they're being met even from home working.
What is the position if someone is in self-isolation or has been in self-isolation and is displaying symptoms and then they show up to work?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, I think again the starting point is that both employers and employees have duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So workers themselves are required to take reasonable care to maintain both their own health but also to ensure that they don't have any negative impact on the health of their colleagues. They're also required to follow reasonable instructions from their employer, particularly where that employer is trying to obviously comply with its own obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. I think what's critical is for employers to make sure that they are complying with the government policy on self-isolation, but also requiring their employees to do the same. And again, requiring their employees to not come to work if they are displaying any of the symptoms of coronavirus at the moment. If the employee does breach those instructions, it's important for employers to send those employees home, and or they can also be disciplined in those circumstances for breaching their own obligations.
At the moment, there is obviously only a limited number of cases in New Zealand, but we're seeing increasing action from a number of employers. What are some of the preventative measures that employers can take at this stage, while the outbreak is kind of limited in scope?
Yeah, so some of them are really obvious and most of us would have seen in some form or other. But first and foremost, of course, we should be encouraging workers to follow basic personal hygiene practices. So as we know, this is hand washing, sneezing in or coughing into the crook of your elbow, not your hands, having, if you can and it's available, hand sanitizer or antibacterial wipes available for everyone to clean surfaces and clean their hands where soap and water is not available. You can also think about things like the physical layout of your office. So is it conducive to people being able to stay a little bit further away from people, or is there something you can do to change that, even in terms of behaviour? So water cooler discussions, is that something that should still be happening, or should we be discouraging that? If you think a co-worker is sick, you can suggest that they stay at home, or obviously leave the workplace. And again, encouraging others to do the same. So not just management in these circumstances. It's a responsibility of everybody to make sure that we stay healthy. It's a good idea, and I think we've touched on this, for employers to develop risk management and communication plans which address who employees should contact and what they should do if they're sick and have questions. If also feasible, employers should be working out whether or not they can work from home and bolstering their systems and training their employees to be able to do that. And they should be thinking about contingency plans. So what happens if, for example, you have 2 IT people and they're both out with coronavirus and you're having IT issues? So again, thinking about whether or not you have a backup plan if a number of people are out ill. And on that, trying to stop people from getting ill. So we've seen examples of employers even having shift systems in place whereby half their workforce is in the office at any one time, so they're keeping social contact, but also trying to limit the effects or the impact if some of those people do end up with coronavirus. So there's a number of things I think people can be doing, and again, looking at your policies and procedures just to make sure they're up to date and contemplate what we're experiencing right now, which, as we've said, is changing fast and unprecedented. So I think it's important to keep an eye on those things.
What we're dealing with is fairly unprecedented in our lifetime, and you've obviously kind of addressed a number of issues. Is there any final advice that you can give to employers?
Always. I think this situation can and is evolving quite quickly. So please make use of all the public sources of information and or contacts that you have to find out the latest news on what is happening and how we should be reacting. Obviously, immediately contact the Healthline if you or anyone display symptoms before showing up at a clinic, and definitely before coming to work, to limit the spread. But the final thing I would say is we've just scratched the surface today on what we're talking about in terms of this virus and things employers need to think about. There's lots of other issues that are naturally being considered by businesses around the impact of coronavirus on employment, particularly concerning the suspension of workers during a slowdown period, and looking at potential alternatives to making redundancies. One of the things we will be doing is releasing another podcast shortly to discuss some of the key topics, so watch this space.